What is up, everybody? Rachel here, aka Brews with Beerkowski, and I am here to talk to you today about some beer history. I am a certified cicerone and I am a historian, and today we're going to be talking about the history of beers that were born in the USA. So, let's get nerdy. Now, when I say beers that were born in the USA, there's usually two categories that I like to put these in. The first category is beers that were created here in America that were being based off of recipes that were coming from, let's say, Germany or England. And they are different from those German or English recipes in that there are specifically American ingredients being used. Now, when I say ingredients, I mean barley and I mean hops. So 6-row barley grows here in North America, 2-row barley grows in Europe. American hops grow here in America, and noble hops grow in Europe. And these ingredients have a huge impact on the final beer that you are brewing. So when you are taking a traditional recipe but using American ingredients, guess what? Your beer is going to be different. The other category of beers that were born in the USA are going to be beers that were completely different. They were beers that came out of necessity, beers that came out of ingenuity, and beers that came out of folks just wanting to create a beer with what they had around them. All right, so the first beer that was born in the USA is a beer that is pretty polarizing. And no, I'm not talking about the IPA. I'm talking about pumpkin beer. Now, some people could argue that pumpkin beer was the first beer ever made in America, and they would be right. Pumpkin beer dates all the way back to the Pilgrims, those folks that came over on the Mayflower. When they landed here in the United States, it was not yet the United States, they were bringing with them their brewing recipes because, if you remember from some of my other beer history lessons, most folks had to subside on beer as a potable water source in old city situations because the water was not safe to drink. So, of course, they were bringing with them their beer recipes. Now, when you land on a completely different continent, you're going to be dealing with different indigenous plants. And because farming was not well established for quite a while after they settled, they had to use what they had around them. And guess what? Pumpkins are an indigenous squash here to North America, and they were plentiful. And so the Pilgrims learned how to brew beer using pumpkins. The second beer that was born in the USA is going to be one that you're probably pretty familiar with, and that is the steam beer, or the California Common. So the California Common beer was invented in Northern California in the 1850s during the really intense gold rush era of that time. And what brewers were trying to do is they were trying to create a lager recipe that would work in the very level-headed climate that Northern California tends to have. What they ultimately came up with was a lager yeast that ferments at ale temperatures. So this beer is a hybrid style of beer, meaning it has both ale and lager characteristics. And it is an incredibly unique beer. Anchor steam is the most prevalent and widely known example of this style of beer. The next style of beer that was completely born in the USA is going to be the American Cream Ale. Now, this is also a hybrid style of beer, meaning that it is fermented using lager yeast, but at ale temperatures. And actually, sometimes lager and ale yeast is used depending on the recipe. This beer was born in the pre-Prohibition era, and it came to be when German immigrants were coming over here to the United States, and they were bringing with them their lager recipes. However, they were having difficulty recreating those lagers with American ingredients. So they were pretty ingenious in working with the yeast strains that they had and the ingredients that they had, and they were able to create a completely different style of beer, one that is really still adored and loved today. Another beer style that was completely born in the USA is one that is probably the least common of all of the ones that I mentioned before. And that is the Kentucky Common. So this is a beer that has a similar story to the cream ale in that it was a pre-prohibition style beer, and that it was a beer that was created using whatever ingredients were available to folks in Kentucky at the time. It was generally just called a common beer, meaning it's the beer style that was commonly around. A lot of people drank it. There were probably varying iterations of this beer from brewery to brewery or home brewer to home brewer. One thing that is very distinctive to a Kentucky Common, though, is its sour mash, meaning it uses a mashing process that is similar to that used when making bourbon. This unique mash can create a very interesting acidic or even tart flavor to the beer. But even though this beer isn't really around very much anymore, it still is historically relevant to beer styles in the United States history. So to give you some examples of beers that were also born in America that are very important to our brewing culture as it is constantly evolving and developing, would be New England style IPA, American barley wine, American stout, American red ale, American pale ale, American imperial or double IPA. These are all examples of styles of beer that America has, I would argue, helped revolutionize worldwide. But these beers are different than the four that I just mentioned because, as I said earlier, these beers were initially created by brewers using recipes from England or Germany. But what makes them wholly unique and very, very different from those original recipes is that American ingredients are being used when brewing them. So that's where that big divide starts to happen. And that's why English IPAs versus American IPAs are very different. An Irish stout versus an American stout are very different. An English barley wine versus an American barley wine are very different. This is all just the beauty and diversity of beer. I think that there is a beer style for every single person out there because the variety is huge and the palette that beer allows us to experience is unlike anything else. So I hope you enjoyed today's history lesson. I love to tell stories and I love to get nerdy. And as always, if there's something you want to learn about pertaining to beer history, please comment below. I would love to hear what you want to learn about. Cheers.